Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Mike Dunham, and I'm the president of Intuitive Technology Group. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining our webinar. I think you'll find it to be very interesting. The topic today is going to be my misadventures in selecting and implementing a DLP system. And we'll get into that in a moment. I just wanted to take a very brief amount of time to introduce you to the topic today. Again, we'll be focusing on DLP and some of the considerations that you'll be wanting to look at in terms of integrating it with some of your other solutions, and also some of the things that we've seen as best practices. And to do that, we'll be using some stories as well as some examples of how one of our consultants worked through all these things with a particularly large client. So with that, we'll dive in and get started. Again, we'd also like to thank Symantec for sponsoring this webinar, and we appreciate their support and their partnership, and hopefully you'll find today's meeting very informative. With that, I'd like to spend just a moment telling you about Intuitive, and then I'll turn it over to our speaker, David. So Intuitive is a company that's been around for about 12 years. We're actually in our 13th year of business, and I'll just be really brief and say we engage with our clients as they need us to, and that can be in terms of engaging by offering them specific products and licensing that fall around our skill sets, or by helping them either in a coaching capacity or providing them training or project work to help them get their technology to the point they need it, or providing them with either the temporary or permanent staff to get their projects going and keep their organizations running. And we engage in a variety of IT areas. First of all, we have a long history of IT systems management. We have been a security partner for many companies for many, many years. Over the years, we've developed capabilities in big data as well as in DevOps. And in addition to that, we do some general business consulting in areas of lean and agile, as those fit very nicely with our other capabilities. So we do project work for clients ranging in things, for example, for CIS compliance or implementing their patch management or other things along those lines through their security practices. Obviously, we deal with DLP, CASB, Proxy, single sign-on, some of the other things that certainly went into the projects we'll be talking about today. We have folks who can help you with your DevOps practice and building that out, and whether that means developing a CI/CD pipeline, whether that means helping you with your QA, whether that means implementing security into your practices, implementing your Scrum, implementing your Kanban, getting the cadence going for your sprints, all those things, and certainly tons of things around big data implementation, as well as all the things that go into that, including the visualization, the data warehousing, the data lakes, the on and on and on. So with that, I'd like to jump into the content at hand. I know everybody wanted to attend this meeting for the purpose of learning a little bit about DLP, and so I'm going to jump into a quick intro of our speaker today, David Roberts. David has been a consultant that I've been working with for the past 15 years or more. Actually, I think it's more than that now that I consider it. And David started as an infrastructure engineer, and he's helped some of the largest companies in the country and world implement various technologies for managing their infrastructure, for helping them identify ways to save money with their asset management projects, helping them in administering their SQL databases. He's also worked with some public sector entities, including some large universities and other organizations like that. And about 7 or 8 years ago, David set his sights on security and taking all of his knowledge that he gained from 10 plus years in the infrastructure side, he went out, got his CISSP, and began doing consulting work for a number of organizations and helping them straighten up some of their security issues and helping them become better at making sure that the things that should be protected were protected, that access was there when it needed to be, that protection for the company and the individual user and the data was all implemented and enhanced. And he's had the opportunity through that to work with, again, with some additional large clients. And he's going to spend a little bit of time talking about a particular client he worked with that is a very large company with a global presence, and how they went through their exercises in selecting and implementing their DLP solution, and some of the adventures he had in terms of getting that selection process done, getting the integration done, and all the planning that went into it so that they were able to hit the ground running and successfully implement. And he'll share some stories about some of the pitfalls as well. Every project, the larger the organization, the more complexity, the more opportunity there is for things to go wrong. And certainly every project has those. And he'll talk about some of the creative ways he was able to get things back on track, or where he discovered potential problems and was able to sidestep them. So again, I think you'll find this to be a very interesting and useful presentation. We are going to record this, so if you'd like to refer back to it in the future, please do so. If you'd like us to send you a copy of the presentation, please feel free to shoot a message to us through the chat, or feel free to reply to one of the emails we've sent as reminders for this, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. As far as the presentation goes today, David's going to be rolling through. If you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll pose them to David as he has breaks in his delivery, so we can talk about those topics while they're fresh. In addition to that, if we have a little time at the end, I'm sure he'll be happy to do some Q&A, and we can open up the lines at that time. So with that, I'd like to thank you for being here, and thank David Roberts for taking the time to share this information with us. And David, please feel free to share out your screen and take it away.
Good afternoon. This is David Roberts. All right. If you would, please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can, David. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay. I am here to talk about my experiences working with DLP and extending DLP into the cloud, and that means a lot of work with Proxy as well as CASB. I'm going to talk about a particular experience over at a Fortune 50 enterprise, very large enterprise environment. Spent around about 1.5 years chasing this from concept all the way up to implementing and putting this into production. I worked with major vendors for Proxy, CASB, and DLP. And to the best of my knowledge, this was quite possibly the first large enterprise integration of DLP, CASB, and Proxy for the cloud. All right. So first, let me speak about cloud growth. That's the thing driving all of this. Right now, Gartner predicts 21% growth in the cloud in 2018. It's a $186 billion market in 2018. And I've got a graph here from Gartner showing that that trend is expected to continue in every growth area here that they're monitoring. Absolutely, being able to extend into the cloud is a requirement business has to be able to do. So the first thing I'd like to get into is really stating that you need to ask yourselves, what is it that you want out of the cloud? there's no one size fits all. Cloud services really fall, excuse me, into three categories. First, IaaS, infrastructure as a service. A good example of that would be your Amazon EC2. Software as a service. A good example of that would be something like Semantics Email Prevent for the cloud. You also have something like Platform as a service, and that would be something like your Cloud PaaS. Now, for DLP itself, that one is unlikely to be used for DLP, but certainly your IaaS and SaaS are absolutely going to come up in most common use cases, especially for an enterprise. So let me get
David, if I can ask you, in this particular one, what type of cloud services was this particular client using? Were they primarily an Amazon shop, or did they use Azure, or did they have? I'm assuming they had their own data centers as well.
Yep, they had their own data centers as well. They started off as an Amazon shop. They had quite a bit up in Amazon with EC2, and with time they transitioned over to Microsoft's Azure service, and we use that for our infrastructure as a service for implementing servers up in the cloud. And then they also did quite a bit of work with SaaS providers of a large range of SaaS providers. I'm sorry, say again?
Nope, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So let me go through here and what's so special about the cloud that it's getting that kind of attention, that kind of growth. The cloud can simplify. The cloud is service oriented. It can save money. Your cloud is it requires new skills. There are things that simply don't translate that well from your traditional data center environment. But at the end of the day, the cloud doesn't change your fundamentals. The cloud doesn't change regulatory requirements. That's a big one right there. You need to understand that. And the cloud still requires management. At the end of the day, you are enhancing your ability. How much can you deliver? How much can you put out there? Because now you don't have to do some of the back end work. So it does enable you to move faster and do more. So what's driving the change to the cloud? On-site infrastructure costs are excessive. Predictability, the ability to focus on the service instead of the server. That's really something that drives a lot of growth, especially in terms of being able to say, here, I want to have this particular service in place. I don't want to worry about it takes 8 weeks to get servers approved through procurement. I can simply go in and I can order them up and deliver them. You can move much faster. Scalability is a large driver of the change to the cloud, especially the ability to have rapid scalability for peak loads. You can automate a lot of server delivery and things that go with that. Gives you geographic resilience, and regulatory requirements can also drive that change, especially if you don't have the in-house capabilities to meet certain requirements and you've got a provider that can do that for you. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that's where the business is going. And so technology, IT, and security needs to keep up with that, and we need to keep pace with the business.
So David, in terms of how that impacted your work, I'm assuming, this particular client I know has been cited as a leader in DevOps, and they've really been moving towards infrastructure as code and things like that.
Yes.
Did that have a pretty profound impact on how you designed out the DLP environment and what some of the requirements were for that?
Absolutely. We had to be able to look at and support those environments. We had to be able to look at things like okay, we've got a lot of code in play. We're using different repositories. Our developers are using these tools already, and we need to catch up, and we need to make sure that we have the ability that we can work with these tools and, GitHub, et cetera, and that we can monitor them, and we can know, for example, let's say we want to make sure that nobody's posting private keys up on GitHub. And that was something where we found indeed that there were some people who posted private keys on GitHub, and we were able to find those and remove those and get those replaced right away without having an incident. So that culture is absolutely driving it. And your developers are going there now, even if you're not. And that's something you've got to be on top of, and you've got to be ready to go. All right. Now, I want to talk about a little bit on some of the challenges that the cloud brought. Your on-premise tools often don't work off-premise. Your traditional antivirus, DLP, et cetera, you've got data, and you have no means by which you can extend your tools up to these providers so that you can make sure that you are, for example, not putting private keys up in GitHub where they're publicly available. So that's a real challenge right there. The tools that the cloud providers have are typically quite limited in capability. I want to give a good example there. You'll find a number of providers, CASB and otherwise, Salesforce or whatnot. They have certain tools to go through and scan the data natively, but they are typically very limited to a very, you might have a very basic PCI capability, or you might have a very basic regex, but you're going to discover that those are almost certainly not going to meet your needs. And you can't really blame the providers. Their focus is providing a service like Salesforce, not in providing a service like DLP or otherwise that you're looking for. There are management issues. How do you manage data when you don't control the servers? How do you manage standards such as your data classification standards? So you have any number of management tool challenges that you simply don't have on the corporate network, where you have the ability to simply get to things. You no longer have that level of control, and that means giving over a certain portion of your control. Additional problem that you're going to have there is that the cloud is not going to be part of the network, especially if you're talking about SaaS providers. You can't simply reach over and scan something or change something or edit it. So you've got some real challenges there. Now, with IaaS, you can make it part of your network, and you can then go in and you can extend the tools that you have on your enterprise network, and you simply extend those and you scan that, treat it, if you will, as an additional data center. So what do you need? Requirements. That's one of the hardest, that is one of the firmest things that came out of my experience, was discovering just how firmly you needed to get a very good grasp on what the requirements are, not just technical, but from the business and all the other parties, network team, people who do run projects, and so on, senior leadership. Now, this is a big one right here. The network team must be fully committed for both time and personnel. Extending up into the cloud, extending up into CASB with Proxy and so on, it is a huge investment in time, resources, and personnel, and you need to make sure that the network team has the time and people available to assist. They will absolutely be a very integral part of getting everything up and running, and you absolutely depend on them for success. The business must be committed with time and availability. You don't necessarily need personnel from them, but you do need the ability to be able to reach out to somebody without necessarily having to go through a formal change process and say, hey, this process that you have in place now where you do a given thing, we can't do that as it is, and work with the business then to develop and say, okay, here's something that we can do. This is how we can move that forward. So you really need that ability to have that continual contact with the business. And in particular, your vendor support is critical. And I'm going to drill down on that just a little bit. You need to have named sales reps where you can reach out and you can contact the same given person and start to establish that relationship where you're not simply going through any given rep. A lot of these issues are complex and require an extensive amount of specialist knowledge, and you need to make sure that your sales rep is up to speed and you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Same thing with your support reps. You need to have named support reps who are working with you and are familiar with your situation. You really need to have a named account manager to ease the bumps in the road. That was one thing that we did not have in the beginning. Even with the size of the enterprise that I was at, we didn't have that named account manager, even though we had named sales reps and support reps. And without that ability to have someone who could own that from the vendor side, to really own that relationship and to have that constant contact, we really ran into a number of issues that took a lot longer to resolve than they should have, and we didn't get the level of support they need. Once we got our named account manager, that's really one of the things that helped ensure the success that we had, was that ability to reach out and have that continual update. And that segues right into having a weekly status meeting with the vendor. We didn't start that way. I'd say that's another lesson learned, but eventually a meeting that we set up with a vendor to go through a few technical issues became a standing call. And that became a very important call to have every week, so that everybody could be on the same page and we could follow up on issues that were discovered. A lot of this is bleeding edge, and you really need to make sure that you're getting support and follow through with your vendor. Now, are there any questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask you on that front. So did you actually have the vendor in the weekly status meetings with all the cross-functional teams, or was that a separate meeting where you brought the results to the account manager?
We did both.
Okay. Sorry. No, please go ahead. I was just trying to get into the sense of how you came to involve the vendor and what were some of the issues that the vendor helped you resolve.
We started with the cross-functional meetings. For example, when we originally started going and getting everything up and running, the ability to do network prevent up through Proxy in the cloud and up through CASB was something that would work one time, but then didn't work in other times. We were getting inconsistent results. And we really had to do a lot of follow-up with the vendor, and we had to work internally as well, those cross-functional teams, where we would work with the network teams and we had those relationships so that when something happened, we didn't have to go through the formal change control process just to be able to trace something down. We had that ability to cut a lot of the red tape. And then that morphed into inviting vendors to meetings, and then eventually we transitioned to having 2 different meetings every week, one internal and then one external with the vendor. But the end result was we needed to have everybody on the same page, and that was one of the most critical lessons that we learned. And there were some painful moments in the beginning where we didn't have everybody on the same page, where perhaps we had technical people on the same page, but you didn't necessarily have the business on that same page.
Excellent. So in some ways, you actually could use your account rep to to deliver the message back into the business stakeholders.
To a certain degree, but really just getting everybody there on that same page and making sure that everybody knows here are the problems and this is where it's at, having that crisply defined so that you don't get into a situation of, I thought, Bob was working on that, or I thought Mary was working on that. Having that clear ownership was just really important for success.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, all right. So what's involved here? Fundamentally, there are 3 services that are critical for protecting your data in the cloud. You need DLP, which I would imagine many organizations already have at least some level. You need your proxy to provide access to your egress data. And you need CASB for integrating with SAS. With these 3 items, you gain the ability to start gaining control over your data up in the cloud. So how do you protect the data that you have in the cloud where you don't have your traditional controls? First and foremost, you use a CASB. That stands for Cloud Access Security Broker. Your CASB provider provides that conduit. CASB acts as a broker between on and off premises, and that allows you to extend your controls up into the cloud. Having a good CASB provider is absolutely critical for protecting data in the cloud. Now, CASB works, it uses API calls to integrate with your SAS providers, Box, O365, Salesforce, ServiceNow, etc. Depending on the SAS you have, you can protect your data in motion, you can protect your data at rest, or both. One thing to give people a heads up on is it's not at all uncommon that a particular CASB provider may have support for, typically it would be DIM for a given SAS provider, but they would not have support for DAR, for example. In general, your data and use protection is quite limited. There's just not much there at all for data and use. Okay, your high-level requirements, identify your stakeholders, identify what you're integrating. And really your 3 big pieces there, your proxy, your CASB, and DLP. Identify your needs as far as detection versus prevention goes. That is going to be one of the most important things you have, and you need to nail that down as early in the process as you possibly can. A lot of providers will give you an ability to detect and you'll create an alert, but they don't give you the ability to prevent. And you need to know internally whether or not that is important and something you need to have. And you need to make sure potential vendors can meet your requirements for that. Not all vendors are going to be able to do that. If you need to prevent data egress, make sure your vendor supports it. Good example there is ResponseMod is required to prevent data loss for data in motion for proxy. Not all vendors support that, and there's some fairly big ones that do not. Cloud provider restrictions. Good example there, GDPR may restrict you from using North American data centers, especially if you've got data out in the EU that's sensitive. So that's something that you've got to pay real close attention to, and you need to find out early on in the process that may end up changing your architecture to meet those requirements. And another important thing that you want to make sure of is you want to make sure you can integrate with your SIM for your SOC so that you're getting all the logging data wherever it is that you have your SIM, whether it's local, whether it's up in the cloud. You don't want to get in a situation where your SOC has to go into another platform to start going through logs and trying to learn things. Not all providers are going to provide that capability. So you want to make sure you've got in writing you can do that, And you also want to make sure that if there are any charges for doing so, you know what those charges are ahead of time and you don't get surprised.
It's interesting you bring that one up, David. I was actually just speaking with an organization this morning, and the security analyst made the comment that they actually had to overhaul their DLP because the guy who set it up was monitoring it himself, and many alerts were going to him. And when he left the organization and transitioned over, the new guy simply wasn't aware of it. And so they wound up having it doing remediation and having it doing the appropriate blocking for what had been set up in the past. But because they hadn't integrated with their SIM, the security team for a short period of time was potentially flying blind with DLP, and it got out of sync with their requirements. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I've seen that in other organizations be something that hadn't been planned for, and the transition of roles, that if you're not integrating with some of your platform security, can easily get you in trouble.
Yeah, and that's really important. One of the lessons that we learned was that there was additional items for the logging, and not all of that information was originally being exported to the SIM. So we were getting some material when it came to incidents, but we were not getting all the material. So for example, we might know that a given file violated a given policy, and we knew that information. We didn't necessarily have the big picture on how many times was that file shared out, how many times, when was the file uploaded, when, and so on and so on. And that became a real issue, and we had to work with the vendor to get them to export all the information we needed to the SIM, so that our SOC could go to a single place, and we could reduce the amount of time that we had people responding to something by manually digging through multiple log sources. You really want to make sure you can have that seamless integration, and that it's reporting all the information that you're looking for. All right. Now I'm going to continue here, high-level requirements. Number 2, that's really more than we could put on one page. Really important thing that you're going to want to make sure of is integration with your third-party services. Here, what particularly comes to mind is making sure that your vendors support whatever tools you're using for your SSO or SAML requirements for signing on. That's one particular one that comes to mind. But if there are other requirements that you have like that, that's something you want to find out ahead of time. It's something we didn't originally put a lot of thought into. Where I was at, the enterprise I was at has an entire separate, very large dedicated IAM team, and it wasn't something we put a lot of thought into until we heard from them, and turned out there were some issues there that needed to be addressed, and those can be quite a handful to address, and fairly time intensive. So make sure you gather all of those requirements. The next big thing is, what are your use cases? I give some examples here, Box, ServiceNow, O365, Salesforce, Workday, and so on. But you really need to talk with the business and find out what is it that they're monitoring, what is it that they're needing to monitor. And depending on your use cases, that can really help influence who you're going to pick as your CASB provider, because not all CASB providers are the same. Will O365, for example, coverage is fairly common. Salesforce is not necessarily that common, and certainly something like Workday isn't. So you really need to know your use cases, and you need to know both data in motion and data at rest. Okay, now I'm going to touch on governance here. one of the things that you really need to look at is what are your regulatory requirements. SOX, PCI, HIPAA, GDPR is our relatively new one, etc. You really need to understand what those are, and you need to make sure that your vendor can support those regulatory requirements. A good example for that may be if you've got DLP with GDPR, if your privacy team in your environment has said that you cannot have any data, any sensitive data that may be captured by DLP go back to the US at all, then you need to know that right away in the process so that you can take that and move that over and make sure you're getting that on the appropriate infrastructure over in the EU. And you may even need to have separate management server and whatnot to meet those requirements, whatever those are. But it's something you need to find out early on so you can design around that. And you need to have those conversations with the appropriate teams. All right. Next real thing is to say, you really need to be able to say, what's your data? And that's going to define what your needs are as well as the vendors that can meet them. Data at rest, detection and quarantine, data in motion, your detection and prevention, and your data in use. Now, for data in use, endpoints can be supported by an agent, and that could be a data in use. I'm not aware of any data in use support for databases, but in general, servers are a challenge for the industry, and you don't have much support for data in use at all. All right, to continue on with this here, knowing your data, it's something that this is really required for knowing what services you need. Example for that is, let's take SharePoint being used by O365 users for file storage. Let's say you've got an internal company policy that says that SharePoint can be used for confidential data, and it is allowed to store a certain level, certain sensitivity of data up in SharePoint, and that's considered acceptable. So your data at rest use case there would be, all right, let's make sure, for example, that PCI data is not being stored in SharePoint, because we certainly don't want to expand PCI scope up to SharePoint. So in that case, CASB would use your API calls to scan your data at rest for using your policies for PCI data. Now, your data in motion use case would be to say, you can store confidential data in SharePoint, but confidential data is not allowed to egress SharePoint. In other words, you can store it there, but you can't send it out or share it with people outside the organization. And for that, you need to have CASB use API calls to monitor your data in motion. And then you also need to potentially have set up prevention there as well with your DLP. And those are going to be separate actions, even though they're both API calls. Your data in motion, data at rest are handled very differently on the back end, and that's something you need to be very conscientious of. Good rule of thumb is vendor DIM for CASB coverage is always better than dark coverage. For a lot of vendors, it can be a difference of, you might have a couple dozen software as a service applications where you have dark coverage, and you could have hundreds, maybe 1,000, where you have DIM coverage. So it is a significant difference, and that's why you really need to understand what your data is there. And if you have a need to scan data at rest, say Salesforce, ServiceNow, or whatnot, you really need to make sure that your vendor provides that capability to do that for your data at rest. All right, now I'd like to get into integration on why you want to integrate these services and really look at things holistically. To start with, your CASB tools are very limited in function. A lot of them will have a built-in IAM, AV, DLP, and so on, but these are typically limited to very simple PCI, regex matching, that kind of thing. Certainly nothing that you would ever use internally in your organization. More to the point, you would prefer to extend your existing controls, whatever those are, to the cloud. That is certainly far easier to scale. It simplifies your policy and administration overhead. There's less training time, It gives you additional safety in the cloud, extending your existing controls. And that enables you, for example, to have prevention, which is always better than detection. Okay, now for your integration. Integration requirements should drive the agenda. You need to integrate multiple components. On-premise DLP, your proxy provider, most likely in the cloud, that's definitely the direction the industry is headed right now, and your CASB. Architecture is critical for success. You need to ensure that all the components can integrate with each other. Certainly, I can think of one or two well-known proxy providers that do not integrate well with other products at all. And you need to ensure that you meet the business needs. So really understanding how all that comes together is critical before you start doing anything. And if you can, it's much easier if one vendor supplies multiple components. That will make things in any number of ways much, much easier. All right, so I wanted to go through some particular callouts if I can here. First, on architecture. It's critical to understand the integration of components. And that was one thing that we spent a lot of time on. One of the lessons we learned on as we went through everything is that with your vendor, you may have a very limited number of people in the company that know and understand how components integrate. In our experience, we were working with one of the largest vendors out there, and we had fewer than a handful of people in the entire organization that understood how everything tied together. So it's really very important that you understand that. It's also important to understand what network traffic will be processed by API versus proxy. A lot of your traffic very well may bypass proxy entirely, and then will get scanned only for network traffic by API. So it's important that you understand the differences between them. Certainly where I was at, we had a large number of exceptions, legacy exceptions that had been put in place for proxy servers saying this service is exempt, that service is exempt. And that really threw a monkey wrench in things, because we could not scan any of those with DLP because they were bypassing proxy. They simply never went through to begin with. All right. Diagram your data flow.
That was a huge point. I hope everybody caught that one. If you can even just repeat what you just said, basically that, that there were, unless you're aware of it, you could have a whole lot of traffic that never gets seen.
Right, and we discovered that the amount of traffic we had being bypassed was much larger than anybody had realized. And that came about organically, organic growth over a number of years, where you simply had, hey, somebody's having trouble getting Box to work. Let's bypass the proxy. And nobody ever removed it. Same thing for any number of services.
It's funny, that's actually the exact same service that came up in this morning's discussion, was the fact that that this particular organization has partnerships with outside organizations that do use Google Drive, or another organization that has, or that in the past they had allowed personal box account, or personal Dropbox accounts, that now they're trying to figure out how to sort through the appropriate and purchased box accounts versus some of the other, and trying to decide which traffic ultimately can go through. So, again, another excellent point.
Yeah, and this proved to be a real challenge, especially insofar as our initial use cases, where originally we had set up a number of our tests, and we were quite convinced that something should work, and it worked in non-production, where we had an entirely separate environment. But once we got into production, we discovered that certain things we had previously done, Box comes to mind, Gmail, etc., simply didn't work in production. And when everything was said and done, somebody had bypassed things in Proxy. So understanding what is getting scanned and where, that's a really important thing in order to have success. Otherwise, you can easily end up avoiding your tools entirely. You really want to diagram your data flow. Start off simple and try to pin the vendor down. Feel free to ask them, hey, are you using, might be AWS on the back end, Azure, whatever it is. But pin your vendors down and get them to work with you on your data flow. You should never accept a vendor telling you, oh, we get it and then we handle it. You need to understand how their network works on the back end so that you can better troubleshoot and pin down issues on your own, and you know whether or not that issue's on your side, their side, or where it's at. So that's a really critical thing, and that should be something that grows as you move things. And understand that when I say diagram your data flow, you really need to understand not just what are the demarcations within your components in a quick determination, but you also need to understand that you will have multiple data flows, and you're not going to have just one data flow from corporate up into cloud. And you need to understand, once you've got your data flows, where your gaps are in coverage so that you can address those or accept the risk accordingly. Understanding cloud-based integration is just as important as on-premises. That was one of our lessons. A lot of people, I'd seen more charts or Visio charts than I can count over the years, where someone will have a nice poofy cloud in Visio saying, and here we hand it off to the cloud provider. You need to understand the back end of that. You should never have just, here's your poofy cloud. You should always have that understanding of, here's what's going on in the back end and here's where we're at. Okay. You want to make sure that your SOC has that data flow diagram so that they can readily and easily understand when issues pop up. And you want to make sure your on-call has that. One of the things that we kept running into were issues where we had people being called on one team when that particular issue was really meant for another team. And I don't know about you, but I don't particularly enjoy being waking up at 3 o'clock for someone else's problem when someone else is on call for that platform. All right, and then one thing you really want to look out for with your CASB. Does CASB DIM protect data being uploaded, downloaded, or both? And different vendors will have different capabilities. One of the things I discovered is a lot of vendors have that ability to detect data being uploaded into an environment, but they might have had the ability to detect data as it's leaving, but they may not have had any ability to integrate in any method that would allow you to prevent egress. So you've really got to be careful on that one in particular. Again, what are your requirements? All right, major components, CASB, that's your Cloud Access Security Broker, your DLP, and new term here I'm going to throw out, and that is PITC, Proxy in the cloud. You'll see that. All right, so for CASB, that's your Cloud Access Security Broker. It uses your API calls to scan data. It enables you to extend on-premises controls to the cloud. Your DLP, your antivirus, your IAM, and depending on CASB provider, they may enable you to extend additional services and controls that you have to the cloud. CASB, again, this is bleeding edge technology. Change is very rapid, and you'll find things change. You'll find things change literally as from week to week, month to month. And it's important to understand that because CASB is so bleeding edge, few vendors have notable experience, and those that do typically have very basic secondary service offerings, your AV, your DLP, again, those very minimal versions. So you really need to test integration requirements. Their job is to provide CASB. Their job is not to provide DLP or AV or whatnot, that's where you want a tool that is dedicated to that can do that job properly. And that's why that integration testing is so important, and testing meet your requirements. All right, now DLP, most important question, do you trust a third party with your sensitive data? And I'm going to follow that up by saying, can you trust a third party with your sensitive data? You may have regulatory requirements that prevent this, and you really, really need to find out, and you've got to make that business decision on that, and that will drive your vendor selection process. Again, legal concerns, GDPR requirements may drive architecture. DLP itself is also available as software as a service. In my conversations with a number of other people in the DLP community, we haven't seen a lot of uptake on that. People are really more interested in the hybrid model where they have DLP on site and then they use DLP CASB capabilities, or maybe they take up a little bit of SAS, say network prevent for email or something like that, and they have that hybrid capability, the hybrid model, because then they retain control over the management console. This is what I would recommend, and what seems to work well, and what I've seen so far seem to have the most support within the DLP community. That enables on-premises control and integration with cloud services. All right, Proxy in the cloud, or PITSI, you may hear it called. That's important to prevent the egress of data. Scaling is for Proxy in the cloud, from that aspect, scaling, it's a significant financial problem. There is a lot of overhead for Proxy. Nobody wants that job. Legacy Proxy often has heavy technical debt, as I gave the examples with, Box or Dropbox or Gmail and so on. Industry is heavily moving towards the cloud for Proxy, and that's a trend that I see continuing forward. And really having Proxy in the cloud, when I look back, in order for technical success, I look at this as the most important prerequisite, making sure that your Proxy in the cloud is built out well and up and functional and giving you everything that you need, because so much depends on that. It makes sense to have Proxy in the cloud ready for DLP if you can. Let me go back one moment. One additional thing to add there is it's important, as your Proxy in the cloud is being rolled out, that your DLP team has at least some involvement with that process to make sure that you do have things available and set up for, such as ICAP and so on. All right, now I want to get to writing a RFP, your request for proposal. It's one of the most important things you can do. Get your buy-off in writing that your RFP meets business and technical requirements. That's something that we had, and it came back to help us any number of times, not even so much externally, but internally. Keep your RFP vendor neutral. Industry has not yet settled on common language, especially for CASB. So that's one thing that we had to do as we went through a range of vendors, is we had to discover who has what, and so we had to use that we had to, on any number of terms, describe behaviors instead of necessarily using a term, simply because different vendors use different terms for different ways. All right. Put your RFP in a spreadsheet. That's something, not just in a Word document. That's something that really helps. And put things out. Require your vendors to respond in a common format. Really, again, that spreadsheet really helps. And if your vendor can't bother to do that, it says a lot about their support. And for you, it makes it much easier to compare and contrast your vendors, and it makes it easier to answer leadership questions about vendors. All right, now,
if I can interrupt you for just a second. We're coming up toward the top of the hour, and it looks like with our content, we're going to go over a little bit. I wanted to just take a quick break to see if there were questions that had come up that I hadn't been able to address so far. And also to mention to the entire group that we are recording this presentation, and so for those of you who do have to drop off at the hour, we will send out a link to the recording as a follow-up so you can catch the end of this. David's been sharing a ton of great information, and I think it'll be well worth your time for those that have to drop to be able to log in to the recording and catch the tail end of it. So with that, please feel free to continue sending in additional questions, and I'll ask them as they come up. But otherwise, David, please keep rolling.
All right, thank you. Okay, when you're evaluating RFP results, one of the lessons we learned is we needed to be able to quantify your recommendations, especially considering the sheer complexity. As we were looking at DLP, we were looking at CASB, and we were looking at Proxy. Being able to give some kind of numeric, we place values on certain requirements, and being able to give some type of numeric value to say, this vendor is better than that vendor, this vendor scored very poorly, let's remove them. That was really one of the things we did that really helped, because senior leadership is looking for more than your gut feeling, especially when you consider the cost of some of these contracts. You really need to be able to justify down at the nitty-gritty level why vendor 1 is better than vendor 2, and so on. Quantification also provides cover for legal purposes, always useful in case things go bad in that regard, or say you're a government agency or whatnot, and you need to be able to justify your decision. We found it helpful to select around 3 vendors to come on site for the POC. Now, in preparation for your POC, your proof of concept, we found that 1 week per vendor was the right amount of time. Expect the vendor to be on site for 3 to 4 days. You'll need a day to evaluate and reset for the next vendor. And it's critical that your use cases are ready before the vendor arrives. So that, let's segue into writing your use cases. Get all of your requirements. Information security. One example was the need to use SICAP instead of ICAP from the business. One example was the need to have only one DLP console to manage instead of multiple DLP consoles. There was one point in time we were looking at potentially 3 DLP consoles. The need to define success for all parties. That's very important you get that and do it in writing. Design your use cases for production validation. Get buy-off in writing from all parties. And again, vendor neutral terminology, simply because there's no standard terminology yet. And small lesson, it's much easier to track everything in a spreadsheet. For your use case testing, define what the tests are. Don't forget to include negative tests. Don't just use positive tests. That's very important for reduction of false positives. Don't let the vendor prepare for the use cases ahead of time. I actually caught one vendor cheating. They were hard coding on a regex test that they were having trouble passing. Document as you go and get daily sign off from all parties. That's very helpful, just so everybody knows, hey, here's where we're at. We have success on X, Y, and Z, and we have a failure on, A and B. Document as you go, and again, document and get some type of common spreadsheet that everybody's sharing, so everybody's on that same page. Vendor support on site during the POC is critical. If the vendor has support issues during the POC, this is a huge red flag. Review the use cases together before each test. And one very important thing we learned, have the vendor drive during the test. The vendor should perform all setup and configuration, and this ensures that the vendor has ownership of the process and everything is done just the way the vendor says it should be. For your vendor selection, vendor integration will be one of the largest support issues that you have. It's too easy to have vendors blame shifting other vendors. It's better to have one vendor own the stack if you can, DLP, CASB, and Proxy if possible. You have one company hold accountable. Industry consolidation is already underway for this. One example would be Blue Coat purchased Elastica and was then in turn purchased by Semantic. Expect to see similar purchases within the industry. I absolutely expect to see additional consolidation so that vendors can own that entire stack. One important lesson was that some vendors do not play well with others, and you want to ask about integration standards such as ICAP and response mode. You want to make sure that your vendors are working with the other vendors you need to work with, and ask them to cite third parties that they integrate with. They should be able to do so. Okay, one call out, ICAP and SICAP in particular. This is used to transmit data between Proxy and DLP for policy enforcement. Its most common form is ICAP. ICAP is plain text. You don't want to use, obviously you don't want to transmit sensitive data in the clear, and typically, traditionally, this was used on-premise between Proxy and DLP. SICAP is the secure version of ICAP, and your typical use case is moving from on-premise to off-premise, and it's absolutely must support, your proxy in the cloud provider absolutely must support secure ICAP. Okay, now a call out for response mode in particular. Proxy server integrates with DLP via ICAP/SICAP. ICAP uses response mode. There's the RFC if you really want to dig into it. Proxy server waits for DLP to approve traffic transmission. DLP receives ICAP request and responds with approval or disapproval. And response mode is what allows you to prevent the egress of policy violations. This is something that's performed by your proxy provider. It's required if you want to prevent egress. Without response mode, you're limited to monitoring data. And quite importantly, not all proxy providers support response mode. There's at least one very large proxy provider out there I can think of right now that does not provide that support. Without response mode, you're not able to do prevention for data in motion for anything that goes through your proxy. DLP management consoles. Try to reduce the number of management consoles. Multiple consoles are a management nightmare. Capability differences can prevent policy replication, management overhead for two sets of policies and incidents. Human error, when you have multiple consoles, you have a lag time for policy propagation as you propagate those policies in whatever mechanism you have available, whether manually or through API or whatnot. And you need to find out, can your vendor support managing DLP policies for CASB via DLP? If you can, that simplifies your life greatly. I'm going to one call out for network traffic in particular. Internet drains are important. Find out when they will be available. This can hold up your entire project, and this can impact your infrastructure requirements. And that's really important for your proxy server and making sure that's in place. The network team needs to drive the proxy server integration. Don't just set up DLP with your own proxy servers without testing. DLP with secure ICAP can have a significant load, much more so than ICAP, and you can end up tipping your proxy servers over. Architecture must be in place for integration planning, and find out if the definition of on and off network is changing. Zero trust models can notably impact design requirements.
Hey David, on those that last slide,
Yes.
you mentioned some of the things about the network traffic. What were some of the things on your project that actually got hit by this? Did you run a sandbox environment and find out the loads, or did some of that happen in production, or how did you encounter some of these things?
We took our developer traffic and we put that onto a non-prod proxy server to start with, and we set it up with SICAP. But it turned out that wasn't enough load to really tell us. And there was actually, it was quite challenging to determine that load with everything from latency on the traffic to CPU overhead and whatnot. It was really difficult to quantify that, and that took some time for us to get to the point where we could do that. And then once we went into a secondary test in off hours with production traffic and we put SciCap on, and we quickly discovered that with the additional traffic, it was simply too much load, and we simply could not do proxy on the network and integrate it using SciCap. It was simply too much load, and we would have had to buy a fair amount of additional hardware to do it.
Okay.
So
and also you've got, I'm sorry, keep going.
It's too easy to say, hey, I know this works with ICAP with a certain amount of load and want to use that as a baseline instead of your secure ICAP. And there's a definite notable difference in your load.
Okay. Now, I've bumped into a number of clients where they have a zero trust model in place and everything's encrypted all the time, et cetera, et cetera. What sort of advice do you have in that realm in terms of the additional hardware, talking to your load balancers, all those kinds of network call outs?
In some ways that would actually make things easier, because in that type of environment, secure ICAP would be presumed. You would start with that in place. You would start with the need for, let's put everything in place. And if you're treating everything in a zero trust model, really everything is off network would be a good way to think of it. And when you do that, you're simply focused on getting that data to go through your network and your integration with your proxy to make sure everything is in place there and whatever forwarders you need to have. But as long as your data is encrypted, you should be just fine doing something like this in a zero trust model.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, I'm going to do a call out for GDPR. That's your General Data Protection Regulation for the EU that's been recently enacted. Cloud does not protect from this requirement. It's your privacy law there. It is already being aggressively enforced. Companies are already starting to hear people complain about it and bring about court action, even though this has only been up and running for a very short period of time, and really fundamentally prevents the transmission of private data outside the EU. Your concern there is DLP typically captures offending documents and uploads them, and there is a potential that that could violate GDPR, and that's, you really need to consult your privacy team, and your privacy team may require that separate infrastructure for the EU, and that could include data centers and servers and whatnot. Any questions at this point?
David, I think that we've gotten a number of questions throughout, and I've tried to lob those at you as they've come. At this point, I'll just throw out a final call for questions, and as well as to thank everybody for their participation today. We had a really nice sized crowd. In addition to that, we are fortunate to get some hands-on experience from David and some of the stories of his implementation. So again, thank you, David, for your participation today. And as a follow-up, we will go ahead and plan to send out a link to the recording of this webinar. And if anybody on the call has questions beyond this one, feel free to email us, and we'll be happy to do a one-off follow-up with you. But otherwise, I want to thank everybody again. Great presentation, David, and thanks everybody for your attention today. And have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.